entirely on unpublished primary sources in Arabic, which Jeremy collected from a variety of different sources. As the flyer has indicated, Jeremy has been at Northwestern now for a number of years, working in their program in African studies, and is now in the process of finishing his dissertation, which I probably shouldn't attempt to describe, but I can't help but say a few words about it. It is a study of Islamic intellectual culture at the local village level in Gimbala, central Mali. One of the many things that Jeremy discovered from his years of research in French West Africa is that despite the imposition of French colonial law at the national level in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Islamic law continued to function at the grassroots level as the only effective living legal tradition. It's really a remarkable thing, at least from my point of view. Jeremy was one of the first to discover the existence of literally thousands of documents from local village libraries in Gimbala, in Mali. Through this kind of documentation, Jeremy has attempted to describe and, in a way I think I can say, reconstruct the way in which Islamic intellectual culture engages the daily life of Gambalan Muslims. When it's completed, I have no doubt, when his dissertation is completed, it will represent a landmark study, a landmark contribution to the study of Islamic law and Islamic intellectual culture more generally within a modern West African grassroots context. The title of his presentation this afternoon is Grassroots Arabic Literacy in Africa, Text and Social Practice in 20th-Century Gimbala, Central Mali. It's a pleasure to have you back, Jeremy.
Thank you very much. I think you took my talk.
You took his text.
Oh, sorry.
This is all on tape too, you know.
Permanent record.
Right.
Maybe one more piece.
One more piece you've got.
One more piece. Oh, there it is.
Great, thanks.
Sorry about that.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to my talk. Thank you all for those very nice introductions. I'd like to start off with a story from my fieldwork. It's the story of an interview I conducted towards the end of my fieldwork period in 2005 with a man named Sadu Amadou Cisse, who had been the colonial era chief for the village of Ngaina. Sadu was my host in Ngaina starting in late 2001, more or less from the time I started pre-dissertation training in Mali. He was the one who showed me my first private library documents. These included a short history with his genealogy, the names of village chiefs from his family and the numbers of years they governed, a description of the death of one chief in a 19th century battle, also included various letters and legal judgments, and a packet of strange charms for dealing with a host of worldly problems. Tantalizing stuff, though fragmentary, gave me a sense of the range of stories that further research might allow me to uncover. Sadu has shown me lots of other non-research related kindnesses too, but even though everyone told me that he knew a lot about local history, I seldom ventured to ask him substantive questions about my research. For one thing, he often had visitors. More than that, he's just an extremely cantankerous and combative personality. One day, though, I caught him in his room alone and I went for it. I asked him a question that I found useful in getting other interviewees to talk. It's not a particularly well-formed question. It's one that resulted, though, from a long process of winnowing down what I saw as more nuanced, but which, practically speaking, were less effective questions. Did slavery end with independence, or did slaves get autonomy under colonial rule? My previous research had convinced me that both parts of this bland question were more or less true. Slaves did start to get some autonomy under colonial rule, but the structure of colonial rule had allowed masters to maintain much de facto control over slaves, up until the point where independent Mali replace local canton chiefs with centrally appointed commandants. The purpose of the question for me was to get my interviewees to talk about whichever half of that process they wanted to emphasize, and to elicit the anecdotes which I could then use to chart it. Sadhu Amadou, though, in full keeping with his character, thought of the question in less equivocal terms. The European never told anyone what belonged to him didn't belong to him, he thundered out. He was angry not at me, but clearly at the injustice of emancipation, as he saw it from his point of view as a slave owner. Even Modibo, here he was talking about Modibo Keita, the first president of Mali from independence in 1960 until 1968. Even Modibo didn't say a slave woman should cover her hair during prayer. Hamad Usman Aljuma said a slave woman should cover her hair during prayer. Whoever says that the book says what the book doesn't say will see what happened in the other world. Once I unpacked this response through further questioning of less cantankerous interviewees, I found that it encapsulated so much of what I had come to believe was central to the history of Gimbala. Not just in terms of slavery and the process of emancipation, but also the fundamental importance of popular engagement with literacy and Islamic intellectual tradition, the fundamental connectedness of textual practice and social practice at the grassroots in this rural region. My dissertation aims at a new approach to West African Islamic culture, one which locates the intellectual center of gravity in West African Islam at the rural grassroots, and which puts literacy at the center of popular Islam. In this talk, I want to first ask the question of why the significance of popular traditions of Islamic literacy in West Africa has been largely overlooked. I find an indication of an answer to this and disjuncture which I found in my research between early colonial sources and indigenous sources about Gimbalan Islam. Then I'm going to look at some specific stories that my Gimbalan sources tell. These will get us into the contents and the social location of popular textual practice through an intellectual microhistory of one Gimbalan village, Lunde Sulube. Finally, we will return for a closer look at the story we began with, the connection between grassroots Islamic literacy and the local meaning of slave emancipation. This is my best example of how Gimbala's literate Islamic culture is related to broader social historical change, and I point to it also as an example of what studying popular traditions of Islamic literacy can add more broadly to our understanding of recent history and contemporary social process in Muslim West Africa. Here it might be helpful if you take a look at the handouts. It's got my dissertation title and a chapter outline, as well as a list of selected personages and a few books we're going to be talking about. I'd also look at the two maps. One situates Mali within West Africa. You can note the location of the town of Niafunke in the center of that national map of Mali, and then relate it to the more local map. Niafunke is on the upper left. You cross the Niger River to the right bank. That's almost all of the map, east and south of Niafunke. You'll find the central block of Gimbala's villages, where I did most of my field work. And I circled three of those that we're going to be talking about specifically. I've already mentioned Ngaina and Zurunde Sulube, which on the map is Zurunde Gutma. The third circles around Arkoja, the village of Hamad Usman Aljuma, who was the object of Sadu's wrath in the quote I just cited, and the most prominent Gimbalan slave scholar of his generation. We're going to return to Hamadou's preaching priorities and Sadu's response later, but first, we should go back to the beginning of the 20th century to orient ourselves with a look at colonial and Gimbalan sources and epistemologies. So why has grassroots Islamic literacy in West Africa been overlooked? I think that the dramatic difference that I observe between early colonial sources and indigenous sources about the region I study provides one instructive example. From 1903, when a European resident was stationed in Gimbala, to about 1920, the young local colonial administration was seeking to develop a picture of Gimbalan Islamic culture. Their overwhelming reaction was disdain. It's pithily summed up in the phrase which local colonial officials repeated throughout this period. The Muslim question is not posed here, or the Muslim question does not exist here. Now contrast that with Gimbalan sources, where if you scratch the surface in almost any village, you'll find the papers of someone's father, grandfather, great-grandfather. Here I should note as an aside, an important aside, the gendered nature of Islamic knowledge. Women did study in Gimbala, but most of the libraries I worked with were compiled and preserved by men. Now, with just the limited resources I had available for my research, I was able to collect over 30,000 documentary images from 30 libraries in 15 villages. Every one of those libraries contained Islamic questions which Gimbalans posed. So why was this abundant Islamic intellectual activity invisible to colonial observers? The answer, in a word, was hierarchy. Colonial models of Islam amounted to a search for leaders and familiar forms of hierarchy, such as centralized Sufi orders. When French observers didn't find these in Gimbala, they concluded that local Islam was superficial, and they felt very comfortable judging the inner states of their subjects, saying things like local Islam is focused only on external rituals, which are practiced morally without much conviction. It's unorthodox. Muslim scholars have no value or influence there. And they even argued, as we've seen, that Islamic culture essentially didn't exist in Gimbala. At the same time, they couldn't help noticing that there were numerous scholars in the region. Paul Marty, who was the foremost French colonial scholar of Islam in West Africa, built on local officials' reports when he wrote a section on Gimbala in his 4-volume work on Islam in the colony of the French Sudan, which later became Mali. This was published between 1918 and 1920. And he expresses and synthesizes this contradictory assessment of Gimbala and Islam in remarks that he made about the region's largest canton. He wrote, "There is, moreover, in all of the villages of Fittuga, a dust cloud of mini clerics, little schoolmasters without influence and without prestige." So in the colonial sources you can see hints of this decentralized Islamic culture of Gimbala, but the French didn't look into it because they couldn't see that an Islamic culture could be both decentralized and at the same time vibrant and influential. The significance of this colonial blind spot is not confined to Gimbala, I think, even though it comes out with special clarity in places like Gimbala. Paul Marty himself has enough evidence to link those local colonial ways of seeing and not seeing Islamic culture with broader patterns. I'd argue that even in areas where the French had more success finding the leaders and hierarchy that they expected to find, they missed an important layer of grassroots Islamic intellectual activity which occurred beneath that elite level. The significance of the blind spot is not confined only to the period between 1903 and 1920, or to the colonial period more broadly. It's also carried over into post-colonial scholarship on West African Islam. I want to recognize the important ways in which post-colonial scholars have sought to correct colonial bias by attacking the rank racism of colonial reports, by deconstructing the notion of Islam noir, most fully in the work of Christopher Harrison, France and Islam in West Africa. We also have subtler, more disinterested accounts of the Muslims who interacted with the colonial state. Here, David Robinson's Paths to Accommodation stands out. Scholars like these use colonial sources, but they push those sources in new directions and profitable directions. In other ways, though, such scholars who are reliant on colonial archival sources have left colonial bias in place and allowed it to shape their own agenda, seeing Islam in areas where their sources see it and not seeing it where their sources don't. Harrison and Robinson both keep the colonizer-colonized relationship central, and Robinson's model of what's important to narrate about West African Islam is restricted to the interactions of the colonial state with a handful of Muslim leaders. Good recent books by Louis Brenner, Benjamin Suarez, and James Searing each find ways to get beyond that basic binary. Each of them is less dependent on colonial sources, but each of them leaves hierarchy at the center of rural Islam. So at least in rural areas, our picture of Islamic knowledge has been that it's been the preserve of a small number of leaders. So what should we do? I'm not the only younger scholar dissatisfied with this emphasis on hierarchy, but too often the solution that's been proposed has been a choice between either doing an elite history of Islam based on documents or the study of grassroots Islam perceived as being exclusively oral and vernacular. My research leads me to reject that as a false choice. Grassroots Islam was literate, learned, and multilingual, including in Arabic. Ordinary rural intellectuals were engaging directly with literate Islamic tradition. For them, textual practice was an ordinary social practice, interconnected with other aspects of rural experience. Grassroots social conditions shaped Islamic textual practice, and in turn, textual practices shaped the contours of rural social relations. We can get to that view of the phenomenon by looking beyond colonial sources and models to the records of literary activity which rural intellectuals left in their libraries. And this is one of those records. It's the first image I'll show. It relates to the following story. On January 3rd, 1900, Hamad Usman Umaru from the village of Rumde Surube finished copying Doctoral Candidate, a core legal text in the Muslim West African curriculum. On the back of its final page, he inscribed the charm. A benefit for the one who writes this pictogram on the back of his book. He will be able to handle all of its legal issues and all of its letters, if God the Exalted so wills. For me, I read this simple charm as a thesis statement, and one that should be contrasted with the general colonial assessment that I just sketched. And in particular, I want to line it up with a statement made by Commandant Decimé in 1907. He wrote, "There exist in the circle numerous monibabe, scholars, decorated with the title because they know more or less how to read and write Arabic." In contrast, Ahmad Usman argued that these numerous ordinary scholars aimed at a higher standard, that they read books seriously, they sought earnestly to acquire juristic and linguistic competence. In other words, Grassroots Islam was literate, learned, and conversant in Arabic, among other languages. In May 1907, Hamid Usman finished copying another core textbook, the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. In both texts, Hamid added marginal notes, which allow us to reconstruct how he thought the text through. And he added endnotes, which give us an idea of his conception of the book as a whole, his conception of the meaning of book knowledge. Reading over Hamid's shoulder offers a very different perspective on rural Islamic education than we typically get from colonial archives. Hamid's notes also allow us to reconstruct the individual process through which he developed as a legal reader and thinker. Here in this image, we have some examples of notes that he left in his copy of the Tahrid al-Hukam. And you can actually learn a lot about how subtle he was from close readings of such little jottings. But in 1900, clearly Hamid's approach to legal problems was to chip away at their edges with thoughtful but somewhat timid readings of individual words and short phrases. Here we have an example of the much more expansive typologies he added to his 1907 Risala. At this point in his development, he was able to tackle legal problems head-on. He brought to bear on them a much broader legal reading, and in this note in particular, he directly challenged the position which was stated in this revered core legal text. The Risala states, "The sale of an al-Walad, a slave woman who has born a child for her master, is not permissible." End of discussion. Hamid's marginal note, in contrast, enumerates 6 cases in which such sales, he argues and gives evidence, are in fact permitted. It's an Arcadian issue perhaps, scholastic certainly. Hamid did not aim to be a bold innovator, but he did think creatively within the bounds of his tradition. And he shows that the ability to handle legal issues, which he declares his intention in that charm in 1900, clearly included both mastery of the contents of authoritative texts and the ability to establish a measure of critical distance from them. This is quite a bit more, I think, than the ability to more or less read and write Arabic, where Commandant Decimé said the knowledge of so-called scholars such as Hamid Usman stopped. Through intellectual efforts such as his, textual study and Islamic legal ideas became an integral part of rural social experience. Who was Hamid Usman Umar? I don't want to suggest that he was some kind of everyman. He acquired more knowledge than most in his village. But his notes, subtle and serious though I think they were, are less expansive than the average for Gimbala manuscripts of these legal texts. Many scholars in the region had stronger reputations for knowledge, and many of them left behind stronger concrete evidence of in-depth study in their libraries. Hamid came from an ordinary family, which produced some scholars, but many more herders, which farmed also fields that were around the village. As his son put it, knowledge would come into the family and then get lost. He came from the ordinary village of Rumde, which was censused at the time from about 1900 to 1907 as having less than 500 people. Had a reputation for being more learned than some villages, but less than many others. Paul Marty, as part of his practice of compiling information about Islam, would mention a series of villages and try to name 1 or 2 scholars from each of them, and then kind of say that they didn't really actually know anything. Rumde doesn't even come up on his radar, doesn't mention it at all. It's a village that's primarily focused on subsistence agriculture. What did Hamid Usman's mission for juristic and linguistic mastery mean to him? I insist on a partly humanistic response to this question. I see in his note a certain raw pleasure in the mastery of abstract concepts, in delving into linguistic minutiae and juristic detail. But also he was clearly participating in a field of power. About a decade after completing his Risala, he became the village imam. He was often called upon to resolve practical legal issues which came up in the community. Sometimes issues were sent to him from outside the community. By the late 1930s, he was part of a 3-person scholars council, which sought out Islamic esoteric means for confronting community problems. At an unknown date, he received this anonymous letter. Addressed to our adib, our scholar, the letter employs a local euphemism for being close to death and going to the best of houses. It implored Hamad Usman for dua, benedictions, and asked him to communicate the news to our khilla, an Arabic translation of the Fuful de Wuro, meaning the herder's neighborhood of Rumde. Hamad's intellectual trajectory from 1900 to 1907, the book competency he worked so hard to develop, allowed him to assume a position within a field of power which was focused not primarily on how to relate to colonial power, but on a local community, the Wuro, and on everyday concerns, here in this letter, the approach of death. It was a field of power in which book knowledge, in particular legal knowledge, was intimately connected with Islamic esotericism, signified in the letter by the word dua, the dua, or benedictions. That's signified in Hamadou's writings by the way he tacks on charms at the end of his legal texts, where in the charm we've seen, he harnesses the esoteric power of a pictogram in order to become a better reader, and where in charms I haven't mentioned here, he harnesses the esoteric power created by the completion of copying a revered text to take on other problems in the world, in particular the danger that water represented in the flood zone ecology of Gimbala. I'd like to add here that for me, Hamadou Usman's writings don't just respond to contemporary French colonial observers, but also to academic theorists such as Jacques Goody, the prominent anthropologist of literacy, whose labeling of West African Arabic as a restricted literacy just doesn't hold up to empirical testing. His writings also speak to debates about the nature of rural Islam and about the relationship between Islamic law and Islamic esotericism. And I'm hoping that this chance to talk to an Islamic studies audience will be an opportunity for me to ask for some guidance about how these debates have evolved recently, especially outside of the context of Islamic Africa. As I see it, though, the traditional view of rural Islam, represented from 2 very different disciplinary backgrounds by Ernest Gellner and Fazlur Rahman, has depicted rural Islam as substituting Sufism, and in Rahman's case, a debased syncretistic Sufism, in order to compensate for the lack of rationalist book and law-based Islam. Hamadou Usman's engagement with books and legal ideas and the widespread grassroots intellectual activity that it represents challenge these generalizations. Scholars such as Hamadou saw law and esotericism not as contradictory forms of Islam, but as complementary parts of a single religiously grounded epistemology. The next story I want to tell about Rumde's intellectual life focuses more exclusively on Islamic esoteric knowledge. The story brings a few more characters into the mix, and it should help me flesh out what I mean when I say that grassroots textual practices created a distinct field of power. It should show more clearly also how grassroots social conditions shape the content of textual practice. The story is about 3 scholars, Hamadou Usman, Umuru, and 2 others, who met regularly in the late 1930s to seek out esoteric solutions to communal problems. Because I gained access to all 3 of these scholars' libraries, I can reconstruct the esoteric toolkits that they brought to communal problems. And I can also reconstruct the more family-focused and individual ends which they and other village scholars, whose libraries I also gained access to, pursued with secret means, outside the context of the council and the community concerns it represented. My research leads me to the opposite conclusion of some of the best recent work on African esoteric Islam. I'm thinking of the work of Louis Brenner and Benjamin Suarez. We've got an important debate going on between them about the general health of what Brenner calls the esoteric episteme in 20th century Africa. But both of them agree fundamentally that Islamic esotericism is fundamentally defined by hierarchy, and that the power of esotericism is based on techniques for limiting access to esoteric knowledge. The sources I've studied, in contrast, reveal an esotericism which derived its power precisely from the fact that it put the means to solve ordinary rural problems within reach of ordinary rural people. And this was possible largely because literacy and the ability to manipulate sacred texts were widespread skills. I want to note that hierarchical Sufi orders, which are the paradigm of esotericism for Brenner, Suarez, and French colonial observers alike, do exist in West Africa and did exist. What I'm arguing, however, is that there was also an alternative mode for organizing access to Islamic esoteric knowledge. This was the predominant mode in places such as Gimbala, I'd argue it's also coexisted with more hierarchical organizational strategies in places that did have more centralized Sufism. We tend not to see it there because the methodology of searching for hierarchy tends to block it out, and because the louder voices of big-time Sufi leaders tend to drown out the voices of the smaller players who operated within this alternative grassroots mode. What I try to do is to recover 3 such voices from Urunde of the late 1930s. Hamadu Osman Umaru, Num Khalidu, and Jampul Adraman used to meet regularly whenever a problem was heading for the Waro of Urunde, the community of Urunde. They'd seclude themselves in Jampul's mud brick room at the western end of his compound, or head out to his millet field west of the village, find themselves some shade under a particular ibbi tree, and then they'd look for an Islamic esoteric solution to whatever problem the community faced. This is a very different scale of esoteric activity than the typical model of the large regional or transnational Sufi order. What sort of problems did they address? We know from oral testimony that one purpose of the Scholars' Council was to protect the community from nangi, or colonial seizures. It's the blanket term which referred to colonial requisitions of soldiers, laborers, and students. But as I've already said about Hamad Usman, the Esoteric Council operated first and foremost within a field centered on the local community and built around ordinary rural concerns. One recurring issue was rainfall. And the council members' libraries also show that the ends of most Islamic secrets related to rural family concerns. The means used in these secrets, too, combine rural and vernacular materials with the Islamic textual practices, which I'm arguing were also a part of ordinary social practice. The makeup of these toolkits shows that while the field of power sustained through grassroots Islamic literacy could overlap with colonial power, as we see in the Council's approach to colonial seizures, esotericism was not defined by a position within that colonial field of power, but was its own distinct, primarily inward-looking field of power. The makeup of the toolkits also shows that the difference between the Council and major Sufi orders wasn't only one of scale. The Council was admittedly a small-scale hierarchy. Scholars who belonged to it sought to mark themselves off from others. They claimed special powers. And they left evidence that they did have more knowledge than other villagers in their libraries, which are the 3 largest that I gained access to in Boombe. But the Council didn't operate fundamentally by limiting access to knowledge or monopolizing it. It functioned rather by pooling the separate resources of 3 individuals who worked particularly hard to amass Islamic secrets. What made it remarkable and memorable enough for me to hear about in the last few years was that it brought together these resources and aggregated more secret knowledge in one setting than the community was used to seeing. But it's equally important to note that this aggregation could be and was easily disaggregated. I want to show just a couple of examples to illustrate these observations from the library of Jampul Al-Rama, who was the head of the Scholars' Council until his death in about 1939 or 1940. His first document relates to control over women and men's fertility, and it's obvious, which is obviously an important rural issue. At the top, there's a charm against male impotency, which involves a prayer for the Prophet Muhammad, and also an incantation in Fulfulde, and the use of a tree named, again in the vernacular, in Fulfulde, the Jami tree. It's followed by a charm for keeping a woman pregnant, which involves a Quranic passage. The next document has another charm against male impotency at the top, which uses a Quranic passage and the use of a tree named in the vernacular, the Gaudi tree. At the bottom, it's got a charm for the protection of animals, in particular to prevent a particular kind of cow, again named in the vernacular for full day, from getting lost. And you should insert a written prayer and a list of Quranic adjectives for good, faithful people into a rope which is to be tied around the cow's neck. In these next 2 documents, there are 2 charms protecting fields from birds, locusts, worms, and other pests, which involve inserting Quranic writing into first a sheep and then a ram's horn, which you're then supposed to bury in the field that you want to protect. These are just a few examples of the kinds of goals and methods which were involved in local esotericism. They show the ways in which grassroots social experience shaped the content of Islamic knowledge, which was locally produced, and they show the ways that people added vernacular markers to this knowledge, which is also connected with a global knowledge that circulated globally within the world of Islam. Shows also that you didn't need to sit atop a major Sufi hierarchy to employ esoteric techniques. You didn't need a big group of practitioners. You didn't even need 3 guys under an ibbi tree. Secret knowledge was within the reach of a large body of rural scholars, individuals with the modest stature of a Jampul Adraman, or with the even more modest stature of those from the village who he did invite to his council meetings. In places such as Gimbala, secret knowledge, perhaps paradoxically, was also common knowledge. The final story I want to tell moves us forward in time to the years surrounding independence in 1960, and then move beyond this focal point, right to my exchange with Saad Ahmed in 2005 that we've already talked about, and to similar debates about social relations which continue to take place in Gimbalan villages today. We've seen Hamid Osman Umru's legal studies in 1900 and 1907. We've seen the secrets Jampullo Adraman brought to council meetings or used on his own in the late 1930s. Multiplied their representative intellectual efforts by the numerous other Gimbalan scholars whose libraries I've seen and by the many more whose libraries I haven't seen. Multiply it by Paul Marti's dust cloud of so-called mini-clerics. How did this grassroots Islamic intellectual activity shape broader social historical change? My best example for answering that question is the history of emancipation in Gimbala. Islamic intellectual tradition shaped how both slaves, such as Hamid Osman Aljuma, and masters, such as Sadu Amru, responded to this key historical transition. Before telling that story, I'd like to talk about Fred Cooper's critique of the concept of Islamic slavery. Cooper attacks Orientalist scholars for falsely equating Islamic textual concepts and categories with the actual practice of slavery in Muslim societies. For Cooper, Islamic ideas were in fact merely raw material, which masters shaped into ideologies according to their material interests and social positions. This critique should be connected with another article by Cooper in which he criticizes functionalist anthropologists for approaching quote-unquote African slavery as if it were governed by norms which flowed outside of social process, while at the same time determining the nature of social process. It's a nice image and largely apt critique, but Cooper himself is guilty of seeing Islamic textual concepts as norms floating outside of social process. All he changes is the level of influence that he attributes to them. They no longer determine social practice from the outside. They are relevant to it, again from the outside. But Islamic ideas and texts in Gimbala were not norms abstracted from society. They were deeply embedded in everyday social practice. They were shaped by rural social concerns, and unsurprisingly, they in turn shaped other aspects of social practice, including slavery and emancipation. As I've already suggested, slaves won autonomy gradually, but only very partially in the colonial period. And then in the years surrounding 1960, the post-colonial state and the political party which would dominate it struck a much more decisive blow at the institution of slavery. I won't get into the details of this process, but it had much to do with colonial reliance on a partnership with Kenton chiefs, who were, after all, local slave owners themselves. Later on, the determination of the post-colonial Malian state to actually enforce abolitionist law in the countryside and to eliminate Kenton chiefly authority. Before 1960, participation in Islamic education was largely restricted to nobles. Slaves were likened to animals. Masters used their physical labor and sent them off to meet colonial demands for school enrollment and military conscription, to create their own children for Islamic study. Recall now Hamid Osman Umru's notes on the sales of a slave woman who mothered her master's child. I've interpreted this primarily as an abstract exercise of legal reading, as an example of critical thought. And I think that's what it primarily was. It was also a means through which Hamid acquired conceptions of the legitimacy of slavery, a means through which he made those conceptions his own. And remember, in fact, he critiques a passage in the Risala which limited masters' arbitrary exercise of power over one class of slaves. He's arguing for a more rigorous form of control over slaves. This note should be multiplied many times by the numerous other rural legal readers active in Gimbala, and by the scores of passages, each of them read, thought through, and commented on. Many of these textual passages and marginal comments did not relate to slavery, but very many of them did. And when they did, they linked that typical body of Islamic legal questions about issues such as marriage, inheritance, and prayer ritual with a fundamental assumed distinction between slave and free persons. Despite these aspects of Islamic law as locally studied, when slaves could make their own decisions, they sought to enter their master's system of Islamic education. Some of them even used leverage that they gained from participation in so-called modern colonial schooling to enter into so-called traditional Islamic education. Slave participation in government schooling actually precedes large-scale investment of slave children in Islamic education in this area. In the years surrounding 1960, two important things happen. First, or not first, at the same time, there's the first generation of slave children who are invested in a large scale in sustained Islamic education, and at the same time, there's the first generation of adult slaves who are able to win recognition as scholars. So we've got chicken and egg happening at the same time. How can that be? How did these adult slaves become scholars if they hadn't followed the typical path of sustained Islamic education in their youth? The answer is that they did so idiosyncratically. Al-Haji Yeronam of Ngaina is one good example. His path to scholarly status led through Mecca. As a young man, he went on a 3-year pilgrimage in the mid-1950s. When he came back, his master, whom we've already met, Sabu Amadu of Ngaina, decided to manumit him as a pious act. This allowed Al-Haji to marry free women, and also generated in him an interest in becoming a scholar himself, even though he had little or no previous Islamic education. So what did he do? He continued farming in Ngaina. This was the only profession he was trained for after all. But whenever a scholar was around, he tried to learn what he could from him. And eventually, around 1980, he built up enough credibility to go off and set himself up as a scholar in a respectably far-off place, in the town of Severin, which is a crossroads for people from Gimbala going south to more productive areas of Mali. Hamid Usman al-Juma, whom we've also already met. Ask anyone in Gimbala who's the first slave to get a lot of knowledge. Most people will tell you it's Hamid Usman of Arkoja. But despite the fame that he was able to develop over the years, he also followed an idiosyncratic path to scholarly status. He was born in about 1927. He's known as a serious child. When the other kids would play, he'd look on and cross his arms over his wool shirt. He wouldn't play, he wouldn't chat with the other kids, he wouldn't beat on drums, didn't have girlfriends like the other kids. But he didn't have a sustained Islamic education. So how did he do it? How did he become a scholar? Well, this was a time when slaves were gaining more control over the product of their agricultural labor. Hamid's father, Usman al-Juma, and Usman's 3 brothers, and their kids, including Hamid, had a reputation for being hardworking farmers. And the house became known for, as people say, having a lot of dinner. So when scholars from nearby villages would come to Arkoja, they started to choose this house as their host family. I came across a record of the relationship between Usman al-Juma and scholars from nearby villages, serendipitously in a non-slave scholarly family's library from the nearby village of Gagin. And this document states, the colophon states that the owner of this text is Usman al-Juma Bilali, the father of Hamid Usman. And it confirms that Usman al-Juma was interested in Islamic knowledge. It also gives us a sense of his modest level of learning. It's a 24-folio work on basic belief in prayer ritual, no marginal notes, which are typical of other manuscripts. It wasn't written by Usman himself, but by someone else for him. So as a result of his father's interest in Islamic knowledge, the abundance of food available in their house, and the scholarly guests that this attracted, Hamid Usman, even though he didn't have that sustained Islamic education, grew up in an environment which exposed him to Islamic knowledge. Another enabling factor, which led him to be able to get that scholarly renown without taking the traditional path, was that Hamid Usman, like Al-Haji Yero of Ngaina, took up the habit of frequenting scholars as an adult, going and asking them questions. One of the people he would see was Daha Birema, a very learned man and the current chief of Hamid's village of Arkoja. But this was not a formal teacher-student relationship. Neither Hamid Usman nor Daha Birema saw it in those terms. When I asked Daha Birema about Hamid Usman and how he became a scholar, he told me about Allah, which literally means that which God can do. This was his way of saying that he had not become a scholar by the traditional path. When I asked him about other scholars, he'd say, oh, we studied with so-and-so and so-and-so. Two things that Hamid Usman al-Juma did set him apart and helped him make a name for himself as a scholar. First was forceful public preaching. and the second was the composition of Islamic songs in the vernacular. The song, a line from one of those vernacular songs in Fulfulde, is autobiographical and gives a sense of his own consciousness of this idiosyncratic path he'd taken. He said, "Faygoto wa wawide mumobbaam." No one can say he's my teacher. It's a strange boast in this tradition where who your teacher is and this very incremental accumulation of knowledge that you can see in those texts from 1900 and 1907, you can see that happening, is such a big part of establishing a reputation as a scholar. But that's what he said. Hamoud Usman's son, Ali Hamoud, represents the second generation of slave scholars. He was born in about 1952. He began in his childhood to study the Quran systematically with his father. Then in the mid to late 1960s, he started studying more advanced books with other scholars, such as, especially, Birema, whom we've already talked about. And when I asked Birema about his students, the first person he mentioned, his best student, was Ali Hamoud. So this is, you can see that next generation of slaves coming whose path to scholarship is the traditional one of accumulated knowledge over time and studying with learned teachers in a sustained way. The last slave scholar of the first generation I want to talk about is Allah Amadou of Rumde Sulube, who was born also in about 1927, and he was the first scholar in the slave neighborhood of Rumde. I asked people for a while what set Allah Amadou apart from other people of his generation in the slave neighborhood of Rumde. Why did he become a scholar while others didn't? And I could sense from their answers that they were leaving something out. Finally, someone told me that he was disabled, and so he couldn't take part in farming during that period when slaves were gaining more control over the product of their agricultural labor. So instead, what he'd do is go from scholar to scholar within the village. He didn't have the sustained Quranic education that the noble children, or the non-slave children of the village were having at the same time. But through his curiosity, patience, the pity of the scholars, he was able to collect enough knowledge to become not a famous scholar like Hamoud Usman al-Juma, but a credible scholar. And when that historical opportunity comes, and the first generation of Rumde slave children is ready to be invested in sustained Islamic education in the 1960s, he becomes their teacher. This next document is from his library. It's a copy of his Risala, or his copy of the Risala. And it gives you a sense of how you can learn a lot about the individual personality of people and the individual experiences of people who are behind these marginal notes. The note reads, "Because knowledge raises the slave to the status of kings, and it is the noblest decoration." This is commentary on the opening section of the Risala, which advocates the teaching of essential religious knowledge to children, which would become, of course, Allah Amadou's career. I find it a moving anecdote which gives insight into how he viewed his vocation, this very modest village slave scholar. Besides that, it's also an example of how my sources can add to literature on African slaves' adoption and tweaking of their master's culture. My committee member, Jonathan Glassman, has done some of the best work in that genre. But my sources also suggest ways of moving beyond that literature. Slaves such as Allah Amadou did not seek into their master's tradition of learning only because they defined local conceptions of status. They also wanted access to the esoteric power which this tradition promised, which offered accessible solutions to the rural family problems which they now faced as they sought to build their own autonomous families. And Allah Amadou's library reveals an esoteric toolkit in much the same way that the libraries of Jamkul Adarama and others did. Like slaves, masters also responded to increasing slave autonomy by turning to Islamic intellectual tradition. They did so in order to create a language for protesting this change, for challenging the right of the post-colonial state to end slave status. The concepts of Islamic law, which were embedded in the social practice of popular literacy and education, ended up defining the points of greatest sensitivity for masters in this process, and ended up defining for them the meaning of slave revolt. Here we can return to the incident behind the remarks of Sadu Amadou where we began. It's referred to an incident which happened in about 1989. Hamoud Usman al-Juma came to Ngaina, and he went over to the slave part of town and he preached, like he often did, especially during the harvest season. And he told slave women there that they should cover their hair during prayer. From an outsider's point of view, it's hard to see what would be so controversial here, but it really incensed people over on the master's side of town. One scholar from there, Alpha Hamdu Abengaina, got up and he walked the 100 meters or so between the two neighborhoods and told people that's not true, that's not what the law says. Daha Birema Barkoja, who, as we've seen, had a very close relationship with Hamdu Usman, had a lot of respect for him, and been teaching his son, Ali Hamdu, for a couple of decades by this point. He also came, made the 15-kilometer trip from Arkoja, and he said that's not what the law says. This is one of those marginal notes. This is one of those points where the prevailing readings of Islamic law in Gimbala located a fundamental distinction between slave and free persons, and invested those distinctions with transcendent authority. And remember the emotion of Sadu Ahmed's words, whoever says that the book says what the book doesn't say, will see what happens in the other world. I find this a really interesting incident. You can see how Hamid Usman was trying to turn an Islamic concept into a path to dignity for slaves. But you can also see the fragility of that strategy. The issue of marriage was another flashpoint. There's a transition going on when slaves start paying bride wealth to their brides' fathers instead of to their masters. And this is still a real point of bitterness for masters. The story of Abdurrahman Ahmadu, a scholar whose roots go back to Rumde, illustrates some of these tensions. Abdurrahman was recruited to be the imam of the village of Tingora, a predominantly slave village, which, like lots of other slave communities at this time, didn't have the educated personnel within its own ranks to provide an imam, so they had to recruit non-slave scholars from outside. They recruited Abdurrahman, but then they kicked him out in the late 1960s because he refused to marry a slave couple without their master's blessing. This might look like a victory for the slaves, but after that they shopped around for a second opinion from other local scholars, and everyone came back confirming this interpretation. So they ended up actually asking Abdurrahman to come back and to serve as the imam. He didn't because he died shortly thereafter. But the issue of inheritance was another flashpoint. It's the point, a point of Islamic law which, as locally interpreted, said that slaves should not inherit. Ahmad Usman al-Juma did not inherit from Usman al-Juma when the latter died shortly before independence. It's possible that's why Usman al-Juma's book ends up in somebody else's library. I'm not sure about that. Another of my informants, an old woman from the village, also from the village of Arkoja, her mother, Wadijam, died in about 1958, just before independence. Wadijam had worked all her life in her master's compound, but occasionally she'd go off and make a little extra money outside of it. And she saved most of what she earned in the storehouse of her deceased husband's host. When she died, the host called her master over and showed him the sack or two of grain that she'd stored up over the years. And it wasn't a very impressive inheritance. And the master said, well, that's okay. Her daughters, including my informant, can have that. In those days, my informant reminisced, if your master let you have the inheritance, great. If not, you said nothing. Only a few years later, in the early 1960s, post-colonial commandants started making tours, and they expressly addressed this point. They would say there's no longer any slavery, so slaves, like anyone else, should inherit from their family members. And if a case came to them in administrative centers where they were replacing the canton chiefs, they enforced this law. But outside of those centers, it didn't always work out that way in the way that inheritances were handled. There was a slave named Gaina whose master died, and he went to go look for reclaim some possessions that he said were his that were in the master's house at the time. They were being divided up in the inheritance. Alpha Hamdu of Gaina, who we've talked about, said and believed that the slave himself should be inherited, that he should be inherited by the heirs of the master, and pointed to Islamic law, his interpretation of Islamic law. Now that didn't undo the state's guarantee for that ex-slave's autonomy, fortunately, but it certainly did shut him up about claiming any part of the inheritance or claiming what the goods that he claimed were his. Master's discourse, rooted in local readings of Islamic law, had real social consequences. Hamid Usman al-Juma came the closest to developing an Islamic discourse to legitimize emancipation in the face of his master's critique. He argued as a recurring theme in his preaching, not that slavery was intrinsically wrong, but that the so-called masters of his age did not obey God completely enough in order to claim the obedience of their slaves. It's an intriguing interpretation, but one that has yet to gain much traction. Now, Abirahim would often say that Hamoud Usman was a great preacher. His calls to piety were a benefit to the community. But he'd remind people that Hamoud Usman's learning was limited. Listeners should take what was good in what he said, and they should ignore what was not well-founded, such as these creative interpretations of an Islamic position on slavery. Ultimately, Hamoud Usman al-Juma's idiosyncratic path to scholarship limited his influence. Though Islamic knowledge and literacy offered him and other slaves a key path to status, power, and dignity, the long tradition of reading slavery as a legitimate part of a widespread curriculum put practical limits on how it can reshape the discourse. Emancipation in Gimbala continues to be grounded overwhelmingly in the power and discourses of the secular post-colonial state. To sum up, the story of slave autonomy and emancipation was considerably different from the angle of grassroots Islamic literacy, as does the history of Gimbala more generally. Focus on popular literacy offers a way of relating text and social practice in Muslim West Africa, which I think works better than either Cooper's model and the materialist brand of social theory it represents, or the model of the Orientalist and functionalist he critiques. On a more humanistic level, I'd like to add that I found the stories I uncovered in Gimbala personally moving. Stories about the intellectual seriousness of villagers from ordinary food-producing communities, stories about slave emancipation and its complicated relationship to a tradition of learning. A tradition of learning which could be used to raise slaves up to the level of kings, or alternatively to define their quest for autonomy and dignity as a revolt against God. And to close, I'd like to thank the library owners and interviewees who opened up for me this world of intellectual and social history, which I continue to find fascinating, and thank all of you for listening.
Will you take questions?
Sure.
Go ahead, yeah.
Sure.
And I apologize again for having to take off before too long. One of the things, I mean, the images are quite striking here. In your description of why we need to take more seriously local intellectual traditions as expressed by these documents, the marginalia, et cetera. But there's something that interests me, that the comparative side for me, of course, comes from Ethiopia. And the way that literacy plays a role in development of public policy, ideology, epistemology about history, etc. But what you don't say is the role of orality. And orality strikes me as a very important function here, because the conversations that went on underneath the tree and elsewhere are then at some point take a form of marginal comments, as on that last document you had, where people are relating the summation of an orally derived discussion, conclusion, assertion in written form. But that local nature of orality and writing is an essential dynamic here. I want to say more. This is, after all, Mali, where the word is a critical feature. What do you say about orality as a subtext of your documents?
Yeah, I absolutely observe a kind of constant interplay between orality and literacy. You can hear when people are talking. Even now in Mali, you can hear the text behind it. And in a lot of texts that I've read, you can hear the talking behind it, whether it's in the way people will transcribe what is obviously an oral teaching in different ways in documents, or whether it's local letter writing, which often, it's Arabic, but it sounds like Fulfulde. You can translate it kind of word for word in the syntax and the vocabulary and all local Fulfulde. By forefronting literacy, I'm not discounting the importance of orality, and I see a constant back and forth between them. And most of that stuff about slaves at the end comes from oral testimony, but it makes more sense when you view it from the point of view of this literary tradition, which has also always existed. So I think you can understand literacy better when you take orality into account, and you can also understand orality better when you take popular traditions of literacy into account.
Jeremy, you mentioned here on the list the text of Ibn Asim and, of course, the Quran. What other classical texts would they have had access to or would have influenced them? That's one question. Also, when you mentioned Sufism, are there particular figures from classical Sufism that interested them or affected them deeply?
Okay, in terms of classical texts in general, multiple disciplines that are represented in these libraries. Law is an important discipline, mainly within the Maliki tradition, and there's a list of books that are this kind of standard curriculum. People study it there. The Risala is one of them. The Quran is another. Mukhtasar of Khalil is another one end of that. The Mudawwana of Sahmun, as well as a range of more introductory works. And the marginal notes sometimes show much broader familiarity with much more obscure texts within Malikism, usually Ibn Farhun and so on. Other disciplines include the discipline of language, which is very important, including pre-Islamic poetry, which is something I always enjoy seeing in these libraries for its incredible richness, and also the way in which kind of tension within this Islamic educational system that includes this in-depth study of poetry that advances values which are interpreted as being in direct conflict with the prevailing Islamic values that the educational system is trying to promote. Other literary texts like Maqamat al-Hariri is widely spread. Other disciplines, grammar is an important discipline. Logic, mantiq is more rare. There are kind of, in addition to the shorter how-to esoteric texts that I focus on a lot because of my interest in grassroots intellectual activity, there are more classical texts in that realm, whether Sufi or astrological, such as Al-Buni's Shams al-Ma'arif. It's a wide range of texts. In terms of the question about Sufi figures who are influential to them, I haven't worked as much on the particular Sufi texts that are involved, that are in these libraries. The Sufi orders that are most widely spread locally are Qadri and Tijani. And so you often find basic texts like the, a wird for the Qadri or a wird for the Tijani. And there is also the influence of some more local Sufi leaders within Mali, the Kunta Sheikhs in the north of Mali. I haven't looked at, most of the people I'm looking at, many of them are involved with Sufism, but not in a very deep way. The esotericism I'm looking at is much more technical, much more practical for the most part.
Good.
You refer to these libraries as family libraries. Is that just a quick gloss, or do the libraries actually stand in juxtaposition to particular sets of people? Who has access, who doesn't? What does it mean to have access or not have access to them? And for what purpose?
Absolutely, yeah. No, that means that these are documents which are generally inherited within a family. Usually, in contrast to other goods, libraries are usually not divided up between all heirs, but usually go to either the oldest male heir or the most learned male heir, and sometimes. So people who have access to them are generally those who inherit knowledge, usually senior males. But often they combine materials from brothers, so it seems like there's a kind of collaborative family aspect to them, even within the same generation. They're definitely in terms of who has access to them, it's the people within the family, and it's conceived as a kind of stockpile of power that you put up. Now it's, you put them in tin trunks, and you put them in the back room, and if you have any problems, you can kind of bring them out. But these are very much family libraries that are connected with particular individuals. Now it's sometimes hard to match up, methodologically it's sometimes hard to match up particular text with particular individuals. That's why I focused a lot on, in the beginning, on those two texts from 1900 and 1907, which have very clear dating and individuals involved with them. And there is also sometimes migration of text from one collection to another, so that in one library you can, like I talked about at the end, where Usman Al-Jama's text ends up in someone else's library in a village a few kilometers off.
So when giving you access to these libraries, were they making any statement about you juxtaposed to the family, or is this something that just happens?
It was an interesting thing. The logistics of getting access to the libraries was complicated. Many people just refused out of hand, which I completely understood. These are very private materials, and people generally don't want their next door neighbor to know what's in them. Sometimes they were more open, actually, to an outsider to have access to them, or at least that's what people told me. It did involve always setting up a personal relationship of some sort. In the first documents I saw, it was very much a kind of family relationship. I'd stay with the family for a few months and just live with them. It was my first trip to Mali, and I was just doing pre-dissertation training in language and taking some Quran school classes myself, and just living with the family and doing all the things that they did. And so it was an acknowledgement of the trust that my host had in me, that he showed me some of his documents. Later on, though, in order to do the project that I wanted to do, I knew that I needed a larger scale than that, so I had to just see who was open to a relationship, starting off as much more superficial, and then try to keep that relationship going as long as possible. Always people would release things piece by piece, usually one file at a time, and then if they felt that the relationship was going right and I was being respectful in the right way, then they would continue that relationship. And I still try to keep in touch with all these people.
So what did they think you wanted to do with this knowledge?
It's a good question.
Did they come with any
It's a really good
responsibilities?
question, and this led to a lot of problems for me. Many people thought I wanted to use the secret knowledge to achieve the ends, the stated ends in those documents, which was not my intention. Some people understood what I was talking about, what it means to do research. They have students who do research for the National University in Bamako, and so some people can kind of understand that. A lot of people would just say, whatever you want to do with them, that's fine. After we got to a certain level of trust, that's how they would approach it. So there was kind of a sense that they maybe didn't fully understand what was being involved here, even though I always did try to explain to them what a dissertation is and so on.
I'd love to agree with that. That's another question. It's about the material basis for this. One of the things that I noticed in working through Ethiopian materials of the same period is that one of the first things that local political leaders would ask the British for in Sudan, they wrote them a letter and say, please send paper. I really need paper. And as you look at the documents and the paper that they were rendered on and the condition of it, that this was something that was a constraint on the amount of documentation you could preserve. The conditions you saw there are things that were... So what was the material they used, and you have evidence of where they got it. For example, the stuff one of our graduate students here who was working on southern Ethiopia, the Kenya-Ethiopia border, when you turn over his documents that are talking about pastoral land disputes, they're old Italian bills of lading from some company in Turin. And then over time, you'd see that they began to get access to other materials. So can you read onto your materials different kinds of changes in trade and access and the kind of globalization of your communities?
Yeah, the paper market was an important one locally, and you can learn about paper through watermarks that are in some of the documents are written on the back of, rarely, but on the back of a colonial form or something, a census form or something, write a charm on the back of it. A lot of the paper is one of the watermarks that I know. I haven't gotten as deeply into those watermarks as I'd like to, but one of the ones I know is the Three Moons, which was a paper from 19th century, I think primarily 19th century Italy, which was produced in particular for the Muslim market. And this was a paper that was coming through North Africa.
Across the desert.
Across the desert, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know how much research has been done by other people on the paper market in particular, but
And did that encourage marginalia?
I think so. I think, especially when you see a marginal note that bears no relationship to the document. And that, I found that to be, it occurs, but it's more rare than in Timbuktu, for example. In Timbuktu, they found a lot of, in some of the oldest documents, they found a lot of marginalia that is about environmental events or things that have no relationship to the text in question. And clearly, people are just trying to use the size of it. Also, you see a lot of writing on the back of, starting one document on the back of another one. So all of that is trying to preserve paper.
Just to follow up on your question, and you're mentioning the word trust. You had Fulbright Hayes, you had Mellon, you had many fellowships to go there. How did you break through the trust, or were you perceived suspiciously, or?
By Fulbright or by?
No, by the people of Mali. By Fulbright, maybe you went too far. You disappeared utterly. But I mean, how were you initially perceived by the people there in Gimbala?
I don't know if anyone was too aware of what those fellowships would mean, but
or as an American, you're going.
Certainly people saw me as an American, and they associate America with power. And sometimes that was in my favor. I think people it's somewhat hard to judge how that influenced things. Certainly the fact that I was a foreigner made people think that I had a lot of money, for one thing. Just to be frank about it, that was an issue for some people, definitely. People also couldn't understand why someone from a place that they considered wealthy and comfortable would come to a place they considered uncomfortable, and some people thought there was something askance in that. They felt that a Westerner who comes and eats crushed millet is not doing it for nothing, as they would say. And this fit into it, the idea that what I really wanted was powerful secret knowledge that they felt they had to do things with it. How else did that affect? Sometimes the fact that I'm non-Muslim also influenced the relationships. Remarkably little, actually, but occasionally would come up, and at a certain point within a relationship, someone would explain to me that, well, there's a simple solution to this. If you want to go deeper, then if you're a Muslim, that would facilitate that. And usually in a very nice way, actually, in a very gentle way, prodding me in that direction. I would explain it's not something I can do, and then we wouldn't move on in those directions that I wanted to explore. That's probably. Those are the main ways it influenced things.
Did you come across non-Maliki legal texts or influences? There was something you said that left me with the impression that although the Maliki school is the dominant school, there may be other influences at work. Did you find anything, let's say, Shafi'ite or
Yeah,
It wouldn't be Hanaphite.
yeah, not kind of standard textbooks,
Mm-hmm.
but As-Suyuti
Asuyuti.
is a very influential figure in West
Mhm.
Africa. And, of course, he's done some work on, he's got a famous commentary on Malik's Hadith collection, but others of his works, of course, he's not only a legal scholar, he deals with a lot of issues, but his other works show up as well. I think now, more recently, there's been a development where scholars are interested in reading more widely. This is a function of the print culture that's just now developing.
What about theological texts, treatises? Then, is there any indication of, for example, Asharite influences in work in Mali? Or is there any interest
Yeah.
in sort of theological questions?
People identify themselves as Ashari. Local writers often identify themselves
Is that
as
right?
Ashari as one of their nisbas.
Uh-huh.
Theologically, texts which I've come across a lot of by As-Sanusi, North African theologian. These are kind of basic Aqidah
Mhm.
kinds of things. I haven't worked out a curriculum on theology, and I don't know much about how that discipline has been studied. The more central disciplines that I understand more about, the list of books that people read are law, language, grammar. Those are kind of the basic three.
Not Kalam.
I haven't come across people studying it at the grassroots anyway, in Gimbala. I think probably if you went to Timbuktu, you'd see more development of that.
Can I ask a really dumb question? That's the ones I usually like to ask. But how do they learn to read in the first place? I mean, do they have to go to Timbuktu, or are there local schools? Or?
Yeah, they're local schools, and the kind of progression is starting off with wooden slates, and they'll give you the alphabet in Arabic, where they'll just start off with the Fatiha and teach you. They have a system of fulfulde names for different letters, like Sin, for example, is called the Sin of teeth, Sin because it looks like that, looks like two front teeth. And that's one way in which people remember it. And then there's this process of just working through the whole Quran and connecting up the visual image to the sound, and vice versa when you learn to write the sound to the visual image. In terms of learning more about the meanings of words, reading in that sense of understanding, being able to translate, usually with these beginning legal texts, people start doing that. And the system of reading is usually at the beginning level anyway, is a word-for-word translation, where you write down the Arabic text and then the teacher will go word by word, giving the translation for full, and the student learns that translation.
So who are the teachers? They're not these local level intellectuals,
They are.
are they?
They are.
So they have a double function then.
Yeah. And not all of them are teachers,
Some.
but some do that.
Mhm.
There are different scholarly activities which people choose, seems to be on talent or inclination, a variety of factors. But definitely a lot of the learning goes on at this local level, and you can advance quite far without, like Allah Amadou, and that's the best example of this. He's the slave scholar who was a cripple, and he could only move within the village of Rumde. But within that, he was able to develop a range of a couple of disciplines, and there are other scholars who were more learned than he was, who would stay mostly within this area. Not everyone. Mobility was a feature of the system of learning as well. Students would come from far away, and students to Gimbala to study with some people, and some people from Gimbala would go outside of it to study with others.
And come and stay with one of these scholars?
Yeah.
And so they'd have their house in a little guest place or something like that?
Yeah, and if they're children, it's often the father gives the child to the teacher, and the teacher will. A feature of Quranic schools also is migratory. They go around and they're studying while they are begging. that's one of the ways it works. And then they also often farm the fields for their teacher instead of for their father if they've been given, if their father's given them over to the teacher.
Yeah. And so that's usually the way these guys learn, the ones that you're studying and learn like that, as far as I know.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, that's kind of the standard path,
Yeah.
which is not the path of these first generation of slave scholars, for example. But that's the standard path. And it's usually interspersed with other sorts of activities. There are lots of stories of a scholar who, he was tending his goats one day, and then his brother comes off and takes him off to a teacher. And later on, a student who reached a certain level might have to go back for reasons to herd or farm.
And just guys, one other question. I mean, so there's the legal text, or the text that they're using for their discussion and that they keep with them to look at occasionally if they have cases and so forth. Do they, two things I'm wondering, do they also write amulets and things like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's
And
That's kind of the stuff that, some of the things I was showing right now, the ones that, the esoteric documents I showed now were kind of how-to documents, which
Yeah.
often involve amulets.
Right.
For example, if you writing, then you crinkle it up and put it in a rope and tie it around a cow's neck. That's a kind of amulet. There's also a lot of leather workers. One of their function is to provide covers for amulets that people wear around their neck. And the documents tell you how to do that. You should attach it to your neck, or you should attach it to your waist, and so on.
Yeah. And so that's considered part of like orthodox knowledge, is to be able to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's considered, that question of orthodoxy is an interesting one. And locally, I would say this is the orthodoxy.
Right.
Recently, there have been some reform movements within Mali
Yeah.
that are often termed by outsiders Wahhabi movements, or they are insiders that call themselves Ahlul Sunnah, and they criticize this practice as a form of shirk. But local people have their own answer to that, or not, they're all local people, but people who are part of this more mainstream Orthodox Malian tradition have an answer to that and are quite confident in their form of doing things for the most part.
Just kind of one final thing, because it reminds me, when I was living in my little village there were some of the local guys had libraries, and they absolutely never opened. That was totally a display thing, and it was demonstrated that they had books. They didn't have to read the books or show, but they were behind a glass case, and you could see that they were back there. It was a prestige thing. It also had a degree of, like you said, power. It's just in having a book. You don't have to even refer to it. I wonder if there's something like that as well. I mean, how often do people now, when these libraries are developed, do they even have to refer to them? Do they show them, or they just stick them in a trunk in the back?
Well, it's often hoarded and hidden from others.
Yeah,
So
okay,
it's
so
not,
secret knowledge.
yeah, a lot of it's conceived of as secret. Some people will still study with this if you want to study the Risala with your teacher, if you happen to be a student and your father or grandfather or some other male relative was, then you can, if you can't afford the printed version now, which many people can't, pull out the old manuscript and work with that one. It's still a living tradition now. But some of the uses of this literacy are not the standard things we think about in terms of literacy. One of the libraries that I have, the current holder is not so learned, and one of the things he does is that when the document was getting old, he would put it in milk and drink it for its power, which was painful for me to hear, thinking about what was missing now. But so definitely a lot of the standard uses of literacy that we're used to, but not exclusively.
Would students be undertaking texts and, like you said, this kind of learning of the word-by-word translation and things, would they be undertaking that without having learned the full Quran?
Usually not. Usually the first stage is to learn the full Quran, and if possible, 3 times, or even more if you really want to, going from back to front over and over again. But not everyone. Some people, if you wanted to, as people describe to me. You could, learn a few hizbs of the Quran and then move on to books if that was kind of the way you were inclined. That varied. But the standard path, the preferred path is what you're describing.
Right.
Mastering the entire Quran before moving on to other books.
Got an odd little question here, but in the Arabic sense, what is the common word used for slave that you encountered?
Abd is one, but also raqiq.
Raqiq. Is there one more pejorative than the other, or?
I don't know. If the full there certainly is. Machiko is the more pejorative one, and imajo is the more sanitary one. I don't know if people have. I don't know how that translates into Arabic. But I haven't seen a kind of one-to-one relationship. Another way in which this gets phrased is the blacks within the Fulbe. The Fulbe speakers, they refer to themselves often as red or non-black, and they refer to their slaves and other non-slave groups as blacks. So sometimes I've seen in Arabic texts as well that translation and calling them the Sudan. The text that
Sudan or Zanj, does that word exist at all?
Zanj has come up in West African texts that I've seen. It's interesting. The usage of that is interesting.
Older text, you mean? Yeah.
Well, I think, certainly 19th century texts at least, and older than that as well. In the 20th century, I can't think of a text offhand, but it hasn't come up in any documents that I've seen from Gimbala. And it seems to have a specific meaning in those texts.
What is the level of literacy in the village that you focused on, or villages of that sort? And my second question, to what extent did ordinary villagers participate in this Islamic, what you call this Islamic intellectual culture?
I haven't been able to do a kind of quantified study of it. But I would guess that, say, in that early period from 1900 to 1907, there were about 500 people in the village. If you there's a restriction, at that time slaves were not studying, and women generally did not study much beyond an introductory level. But within that population of non-slave male, I would say that the way I would measure it is that most families probably had someone who studied and reached a certain level of competence. It wasn't all the people within the family. There are a few families that had more than others, but most families would have some members who would study, reach a certain level of competence, and other members who were strictly involved, or almost strictly involved in the food-producing economy. So that's the way I would put it. And in terms of, what was the second part of the question?
To what extent did ordinary villagers participate in this?
So I would consider those people to be, for the most part, ordinary villagers. They're people who are very connected with within their families. They're very directly connected with food-producing economy. They all marry each other. There's not huge status gradations between them. Beyond that, though, even people who are not involved themselves personally in study were influenced by it through the oral discussions of, for example, Islamic legal ideas, or through the widespread practice of esotericism, and many, even with a very basic Quranic education, you might be able to manipulate even just a couple of surahs, not even a hizb. You could manipulate some of that for specific esoteric purposes, and you'd also be a kind of educated consumer when you go to those who know how to do more. In terms of law, I see lots of oral discussions where people who had never studied themselves would be expounding on legal principles and marking off lines in the sand to count off a typology with 6 parts or whatever. So it was, and this pattern that we see with some of those slave scholars, where people would be interested in being next to scholars and talking to them and seeing what they could learn that way is a very common practice and influences the way people see all sorts of subjects. Even, a lot of people talking to me about things like cosmology, looking at the stars at night, and get these discussions where people refer to Islamic conceptions of those, which I have not traced to books, but it's people who themselves have not undergone this education.
I don't know how to say this. Where would you situate the community of Gimbala and the types of literacy activity that you saw and that level, and the kind of what you just talked about, the penetration of Islamic ideas, even to kind of daily conceptions of people who aren't necessarily that learned? Like, I'm wondering, because the first thing that strikes me is that it's a full day community, and I mean, like, I don't speak for full day at all. I have very limited experience with it, but on a few occasions, full day people have told me that they see themselves as the bringers of the tradition, as the keepers of Islamic knowledge, and having a responsibility to transmit it to the darker peoples. And I know that there was a certain amount of popularization of Islamic knowledge with Sheikh Usman Danfodio. There's a certain amount of popularization of a different sort with Haji Umar Tal, right? So I'm wondering if you were to step outside of a full bay community within the region, or if you were to go to another full bay community that might have different ties, like where did I know that I'm asking too many questions at once, but like where did the community of Gimbala come from? How is it related to these other full bay things, or maybe, and also to the Kuntas in Timbuktu? And then, like, secondly, what do you think is the relation of that, or I mean, how does that compare to literacy practices, scholarship traditions, say in like a Segu area, Bamanan community or something? I don't know if you can talk about it.
Yeah, Gimbala is one region within this central Malian world. It's where the lingua franca, at least, is for full day, which was connected in the early and middle 19th centuries to the state of the Segu Amadu. And people consider that period as an important period when Islamic knowledge was promoted and pushed to the grassroots, although they all also claim that there were learned people in their community before Segu Amadu came. People there were connected up with scholars from outside, to the north and to the south, certainly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Also connections to farther afield, like northern Nigeria. There are documents, texts of Usman Danfodio that end up in these libraries people are interested in. In terms of the ethnic question, this is an area that's multilingual, even though Fufole is the lingua franca. Most villages are divided up into either a herder's neighborhood and a cultivator's neighborhood. In a village like Rumde or Ngaina, this is the Fulbe and their slaves. But in other villages, it could be the Fulbe and Bamana speakers, or the Fulbe and Songhai speakers. Songhai speakers have had just to kind of go with, just take ethnic boundaries as maybe firmer than they are, but they've had a longer tradition of involvement in Islamic knowledge than Bamana speakers locally, the way people look at it. But Bamana as well, and this would be a kind of story that I would have liked to be able to trace in my dissertation a little bit better, have also been increasingly involving themselves in local networks of Islamic learning in the late 19th and 20th century. But the language of Islamic teaching in the area is Fulbe. So even Songhai and Bamana scholars will, when they teach a religious text and give that translation. With the translation method, they'll do it in for full day. Even a Bamana speaking teacher to a Bamana speaking student will transmit that in for full day. The full day do claim a kind of special relationship to Islamic knowledge, and it's part of, in other ways, they feel themselves increasingly marginalized in local politics since the invasion of Al-Hajj Omar, who set up a partnership with local Bamana-speaking chiefs, and then later on the colonialists increased that partnership, and then later on their own slaves start revolting and saying that they can do things like women can pray with covering their hair. So they look at Islamic knowledge as kind of, and it has been, I would argue, a source of power for them as they're losing other sorts of power over people and politics. I don't know if there's some part of your question that
We should get you talking to him if we
Kind of
can.
a big question.
Yeah. No, thanks an awful lot.